He left me in a hospital bed, paralyzed and outed because I was no longer his perfect son. That's how I learned I was nothing more than his project. River had once believed life followed logic. Swim hard, study harder, and keep your head down long enough success would show up like a ribbon at the finish line. He was 17, ranked among the top youth swimmers in the state, and held a full-ride promise if he performed well at the regional meet. That morning, he was on his way to the biggest swim tournament of his life. The sky was steel gray. Rain slicked the highway. His father, Mason, was unusually quiet, gripping the wheel with a kind of tension that made the silence inside the car louder than the storm outside. River was texting a friend from the team, laughing at a meme, when the crash happened. Tires skidded, metal screamed, then silence. When River opened his eyes again, the hospital lights blurred into halos. He couldn't feel his legs, or his stomach, or his chest, just a hollow stillness that spread from his spine outward, like frost under skin. A nurse whispered something about a spinal cord injury. A doctor explained that the thoracic vertebrae had been damaged. Paralysis from the chest down was permanent, but worse than the diagnosis was what came next. Mason had River's phone, which had been recovered from the crash. A string of messages glowed on the cracked screen, half-finished conversations with someone named Jace, heart emojis, inside jokes no father like Mason would ever understand or forgive. Mason stared at the screen longer than he had ever looked into his son's eyes. "So it's not just your body that's broken," he finally muttered. "It's you." River didn't respond. He couldn't speak. He didn't even have the energy to cry. When the billing department arrived the next day, things only got worse. Insurance wouldn't cover the emergency treatment, some fine print, some technicality. The number on the invoice was astronomical. Mason didn't blink. He just stood up, pulled his jacket over his shoulder, and turned to Eliza, River's mother. "I'm not bankrupting my life for a crippled and confused boy. I have a future to protect. I thought he'd be part of that, but clearly, he's not." And just like that, Mason walked out of the hospital room. No handshake, no apology, no backward glance. Only the echo of leather shoes against linoleum. Eliza collapsed into the chair beside River, her hands trembling as she reached for her son's. Her silence said more than any scream could. The weeks that followed blurred into a cold, mechanical rhythm: bedpans, painkillers, and physical therapists who tried not to look too sorry. Eliza never left his side. She slept in the chair, ate from vending machines, asked questions, argued with doctors, but the bills stacked up like bricks around them, walling off every exit. When the hospital issued its final notice, they had nowhere to go. The apartment was gone. Eliza had quit her job. The money was gone. The man who was supposed to provide was gone. River stared at the cracks in the ceiling and wished the car crash had done more. But Eliza, with sunken eyes and cracked hands, whispered into his ear one night, "We still get to choose who we become, even when others abandon us." And that sentence, a single fragile truth in a storm of failure, became the first brick in something new. But that part of the story hasn't come yet. Right now, all River knew was that the man he once called Dad had traded his son's soul for silence. And somehow, the world didn't even blink. If this story moved something in you, don't forget to follow Heartstorie for more powerful journeys like River's. Because sometimes what breaks us is also what builds us. When they wheeled River out of the hospital, the air outside didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a sentence. The old sedan they had borrowed from a church volunteer barely had space for the wheelchair. Eliza had packed their lives into 2 duffel bags, a box of medical supplies, and a folder of unpaid bills. There was no apartment to go back to, no job to reclaim, no husband waiting. They spent the first few nights in the hospital parking lot. Eliza told River it was temporary. She said it like a prayer, her voice hoarse, her eyes refusing to meet his. The days blurred into routines of survival. They found a rotating cycle of church shelters and soup kitchens, where Eliza always introduced River as my brilliant boy, even as he sat in borrowed sweatpants with unwashed hair and a cast on his heart no doctor could ever fix. She skipped meals so he could have a little more. She held his urine bags in public restrooms. She washed his face with bottled water on mornings when there was no sink. There were nights River stared out the cracked window of their car, parked behind a gas station, watching other families go about their lives. He wasn't bitter yet, just hollow, like everything had been scooped out and left to freeze. One night, he asked Eliza why she didn't leave too, why she didn't cut her losses like Mason had, why she chose the burden when escape was so easy. Eliza just smiled, tired but unwavering. Because you're not a burden. You're my reason. That night, when she had fallen asleep beside him in the cramped back seat, River stared at the roof of the car, and something in him shifted. If the world wasn't going to hand him a life, he would build one, no matter how slowly, no matter how unfairly. They started spending their days at the public library, one of the few warm places that welcomed them without questions. While Eliza applied for housing assistance or waited in lines for food stamps, River explored the internet on the public computers. It began with simple things: how to make websites, how to edit code, how to troubleshoot. Then it became something more, a vision. A space online for people like him, queer, disabled, abandoned, who needed not just resources, but dignity. He began building a forum, then a job board, then a mentorship program. Every library visit stretched into hours. Every setback was met with stubbornness. Eliza called it Equal Root, a name born from her late-night talks with River about trees that grow tallest when their roots are anchored in truth, not shame. They filed the paperwork for nonprofit status from a church basement. River began taking virtual clients, designing websites, managing back-end systems, helping others start small online businesses, many of whom had also been kicked out or left behind. What began as survival became a mission. Equal Root didn't just offer jobs, it offered identity. It told the world that disability wasn't helplessness, and queerness wasn't a flaw. It gave voices back to people who had been reduced to statistics. At night, back in the car or shelter, River and Eliza would look at the growing list of names signing up on the platform. Every one of them was a reminder Mason might have walked away, but River wasn't alone. Not anymore. Still, healing wasn't a straight path. There were days of rejection, nights of doubt, times when River relapsed into silence and grief. But each time, Eliza reminded him, not with speeches, but with action. The way she kept showing up, the way she refused to let the world win. River once thought survival meant holding on. Now he understood sometimes. It meant letting go of who hurt you so you can hold space for who you're meant to become. Because family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who stays when everything else falls apart. By the time River turned 27, he no longer introduced himself as someone with a tragic past. He didn't hide his wheelchair. He didn't soften his voice when saying he was gay. And he certainly didn't speak of Mason not because he was bitter, but because the man simply didn't matter anymore. Equal Root had grown from a makeshift website built in a library corner into a social tech startup that now partnered with companies like Google and Microsoft. It created remote work pipelines for queer and disabled individuals, many of whom had been shut out of traditional job markets. With over 1 million users and hundreds of full-time roles filled, Equal Root wasn't just successful, it was revolutionary. River ran the company from a minimalist office in Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. But no view ever impressed him more than the one from the old sedan, his mother asleep in the back seat, hands blistered from caregiving, hope somehow still alive in her chest. Forbes called him the social architect of the marginalized future. Time magazine listed him as one of the year's most influential leaders. But none of the headlines ever captured the quiet truth of his journey, that everything he had built was born from someone else's refusal to see his worth. His days were filled with meetings and innovation, but his nights still belonged to memory. Sometimes, when alone in his apartment, River would trace the edge of his spine with 2 fingers and feel the scar beneath his shirt. The injury that was supposed to end everything had become the line dividing 2 lives, the one others tried to write for him, and the one he authored on his own terms. Eliza still lived nearby, in a brownstone river bought under her name. She had refused luxury. "I need a garden and a kitchen, I know," she said. So that's what he gave her: a quiet place filled with herbs, morning sun, and a porch wide enough for a wheelchair. Every Friday, they shared dinner. No boardrooms, no foundations, just son and mother, often laughing at the absurdity of their past. Sometimes, River would bring old equal root applicants with him, young men and women and non-binary kids who reminded him of himself. Eliza treated each of them like family. And in many ways, they were. River didn't speak publicly about Mason, but privately. He kept one item, the final hospital invoice, that was never paid, not as a symbol of resentment, but as proof of where it all began. A $43,018.37 betrayal, a receipt for abandonment. He never told anyone that he sometimes reread the itemized charges, not to punish himself, but to remember the cost of silence. Because what Mason did wasn't just walk away. He walked away when River needed him the most and disguised it as survival. So River turned that pain into architecture, into structure, into purpose. Equal Root launched a leadership program that trained LGBTQ+ and disabled youth in coding, advocacy, and digital business. It offered scholarships, mentorship, and therapy. And each semester, River delivered a private keynote to the incoming class, not about success, but about shame, about the difference between being discarded and being unbreakable. He never named his father. He didn't have to. They always understood. River knew that Mason might one day resurface. People like that always did, especially when the world they ignored grew too loud to avoid. But he didn't prepare revenge. He didn't rehearse any speeches. He simply lived, thrived, and helped others do the same. Because success, when rooted in healing, not ego, isn't just personal, it's generational. And River had decided long ago that the legacy he left behind wouldn't be built on the wreckage of his father's choices, but on the strength of every hand that had ever reached for him when he was down. Sometimes, the truest power doesn't come from proving someone wrong, it comes from becoming someone they could never imagine. It began with a knock. Soft, almost uncertain, as if the person on the other side knew he didn't belong there. River rolled to the door of his apartment and opened it slowly, and there he was, Mason, holding a cheap bouquet of gas station lilies, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, and forcing a smile too brittle to mean anything real. "Hey, son," he said. The word son landed like dust, weightless but irritating. River didn't respond at first. He just looked at the man who had vanished from his life the moment things got hard. Mason was older now, less polished, his hair thinner, skin duller, and eyes twitchy like someone constantly glancing over his shoulder. They stood in silence for a beat too long. Mason finally offered, "Can I come in?" River moved aside, not out of welcome, but curiosity. They sat in the living room. River remained in his wheelchair, angled slightly toward the window, as if prepared to turn away at any moment. Mason laid the flowers awkwardly on the coffee table and cleared his throat. "I've made mistakes," he started. Rehearsed and stiff, I let pride and fear get in the way. I thought I was doing what was best at the time. "But you left me," River interrupted, calm but sharp. "Not just physically. You sold the car while I was still in recovery. You used my diagnosis to get out of your insurance contract. You disappeared." Mason's face tightened. "I was trying to survive. I was drowning in debt. The accident, it destroyed everything." "No," River said, evenly. "You destroyed everything. The accident just revealed who you already were." Mason dropped the performance then. The contrition slipped. "I need help," he said. "I invested in a business, it failed. The debts are piling up. There are people, dangerous people. They want their money back. You thought your gay, disabled, unwanted son would be your way out." Silence again. Longer this time. Mason didn't deny it. River nodded slowly. "Let's go to dinner." Mason blinked. "What? There's a place I like. You'll enjoy it." River's tone was even. Calm. Too calm. That night, they sat across from each other in a high-rise restaurant overlooking Manhattan. Crisp white linen, soft violin in the background, and candlelight that couldn't soften the tension between them. Mason tried again, this time leaning into sentiment. He spoke of old memories, swim meets, school projects, family vacations. He cried a little, not for River, but for himself. River listened politely, sipping his water, occasionally nodding. Then, halfway through dessert, River leaned forward. "I already knew you'd come back one day," he said. "I prepared for this." He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder neatly labeled, tabbed, and time-stamped, medical records, insurance claim rejections, sale contracts for the totaled car, A notarized letter from the doctor confirming the day Mason left the hospital for good. River had investigated it all, not for revenge, but for clarity. "You didn't just walk away," River said quietly. "You profited from my pain." Mason opened his mouth, but no words came. River continued, voice even, "And now you're here because your greed turned inward. You want saving. But I'm not your salvation. I'm not your redemption story." Mason's hands shook as he reached across the table. "I'm your father." "No," River replied. "You're a man who taught me exactly who not to become." The waiter brought the bill. Mason reached for it instinctively, perhaps hoping to perform dignity one last time. River stopped him. "I invited you here. I'll cover it." And he did. Not just the meal, but the final unpaid hospital bill from all those years ago. He had it mailed in Mason's name, not for Mason, for himself, for closure. River left the restaurant with his head high, his back straight despite the chair. Mason remained seated, alone, surrounded by food he couldn't taste and a silence too thick to escape. Some debts are never about money. Some bills, when finally paid, free you from a weight you didn't realize you still carried. Because real healing doesn't come from being told you're worthy. It comes from deciding you always were, even when they didn't see it. Mason showed up again a week later. This time, he wasn't dressed in suits or holding flowers. He was disheveled, desperate. There was no more act left to perform. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips cracked, and for the first time, he looked like someone who finally understood what it meant to fall. He stood outside River's apartment building, shouting up toward the balcony like a man on trial without a defense. "Please, just listen," he cried. "I'm out of time. They're going to kill me. I don't know where else to go." River didn't respond. He watched from behind the glass, not out of cruelty, but clarity. He had already made his decision. Later that day, River arrived at the Equal Root campus, where he was scheduled to give a talk to a group of new parents participating in the nonprofit's first-ever inclusive families training program. These were mothers and fathers who had queer or disabled children, many of whom were terrified of doing or saying the wrong thing. Some were trying to learn. Some were still struggling with shame. River walked on stage without notes. He didn't need any. He pulled up a screen behind him, revealing a short documentary-style video he had quietly produced over the last few months. It was narrated by doctors, therapists, and a legal analyst. Each segment carefully detailed what had happened in the hospital the night Mason left, the exploitation of River's medical records, the fraudulent claim denial, and the silent abandonment that had followed. The video ended with a close-up of River's old hospital ID tag. Below it, bold white text faded in, "How to lose your son in one sentence," and "How to win humanity back." The room was silent. Then, applause. But River wasn't done. He took a breath and looked out over the audience. "I don't share this story to shame anyone. I share it because too many children are still being treated like conditions to fix, instead of people to love. You don't have to be perfect parents. You just have to stay." Later that evening, the video went live on Equal Root's official channel. Within hours, it was being reposted across platforms, picked up by media outlets, discussed on talk shows. River didn't name Mason directly, but the message was unmistakable and irreversible. Some people said it was cruel, that he should have forgiven and helped. Others called it justice. A powerful son drawing a boundary the world couldn't ignore. Mason, he vanished again. Some said he left the country. Others said he tried to start over in another state. River didn't look. He had already closed that chapter the night he paid the last hospital bill. But what few people knew was that River had quietly added Mason to one more document, a case study inside Equal Root's private training material, anonymous, but real. A story used not to mock, but to teach, because even the worst pain, if told with purpose, can protect someone else from living the same tragedy. Eliza, his mother, his anchor, watched all of it unfold with quiet pride. She never asked for revenge, only truth. And River had delivered it with precision and grace. The world didn't owe him healing. He had carved it out of brokenness with his own hands. Now, as he sat alone on his balcony that night, looking out over a city that once seemed so far away from a gas station parking lot, he didn't feel victorious. He felt free. Because true power isn't about being needed. It's about no longer needing to be seen by those who once refused to see you. And sometimes, the greatest legacy you can leave isn't your success. It's the mirror you hold up to the people who turned away, forcing them, finally, to look. So now, here's the question for you. If someone abandoned you in your darkest hour, then came back when you no longer needed them, what would you do? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, follow Heartstorie for more true journeys of resilience, justice, and healing. Because sometimes, survival isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning.